Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Open Dialogue. As you know, we are going to be doing different topics with new guests discussing current issues. I know that it might be slightly outside the household topics, but we've got a long season ahead of us. So we will be talking about more topics with regards to what you may face in the actual household. However, the current social issues today do involve our society and what's around us as well. And today's topic is going to be the comparability between Islam and the West. Yes, we have an ideology in the West and Islam as well, and we need to maybe go into much deeper detail as to what that means. We all have our own interpretation and our own ways of viewing things, but I have with me a few guests that's hopefully going to enlighten us with their insights. And remember, this is a discussion open for everyone. We don't know where this discussion is going to be headed, and if you want your input as to a direction, then please do call in. It's a live show, and you can maybe guide us, give us your insights as well, and participate. This is something for all of us, and hopefully we can also give you some personal awareness if you do participate. So please do call in. I want to introduce my guests today. We have Mohamed Ali. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Of course, we have Syed Razawi with us. Very much a pleasure, always a blessing to have a scholar to actually discuss these issues. And we also have a surprise guest, Julian Bond. Thank you so much for joining me. And hopefully we can really go straight into this topic. So when we talk about Islam and the West, now most people, they just look at Islam as just, something that is just of faith-based, which is true. But I think even our own Muslims have a misconception of what it actually entails, because it actually does have a lot of politics. It has a lot of, social ways of being and how we need to live today, which is not just for the Muslims. It is for the wider population. So in saying that, I'd like to have you dive in and give your sort of insights into this actual topic.
Perfect. So I think the first place to start really to look at is what is the purpose of Western civilization and what is the purpose of Islam. So if you speak to a lot of young people, they think that there are two conflicts. They think it's either over here as a Muslim or either over here as someone in the West. And the Dutch philosopher Benedict Spinoza actually put it really perfectly. He said if you place a horse directly between two barrels of hay, it'll die of hunger before it decides which one to eat from.
Okay.
And in many ways, that's how many Muslims are. They're not sure if they go here or if they go here. And the thing is there conflict in that choice. But the reality of it is when you start looking into the depth of what Islam really is and what Western civilization really is, you find out there isn't really this choice, because effectively both are pointing to the same place. And if we look at it in more depth, and if we look at the actual origins of our Western civilization, which is ancient Greece, and we look, for example, at what is the purpose of life. So if we look at that, we can look at Aristotle.
Yes.
And Aristotle said that we're teleological human beings, which means that we have targets that we aim towards. And he said that the main target we're aiming towards is something called eudaimonia, which is basically a good soul. So what he said is that when our soul is content with us, it's like within our soul, we have a good soul, and when we're in harmony with that soul, we're happy. When we're not, we're unhappy. And in many ways, it's the same thing with Islam. Islam is all about the relationship between us and our soul. So we see that as we go into depth of Western civilization and into Islam as well, we find out they're both going towards the same path. So it's not really this case of this or this, but it's how can we now use these two horses together to get us to one destination even further, as opposed to having to choose between one or the other.
Okay, that's a good introduction. We're obviously going to go much deeper into it. So, Syed, what is your opinion about this diverse outlook about Islam being so, different and not in correlation with today's modern Western society or world as we see it and as we know it?
Well, it depends on the interpretation. I mean, we believe that God, our Creator, gave a system of life from beginning to the end. And that system of living and system of life is called submission to the will of God. So according to us, that is what it should be. But in the modern world, things have changed. Materialistics have taken over, and some other ideologies have also interfered and distorted the real aim of life. So we as Muslims are proud to believe that we have a way of life. Some people criticize us that Islam is not a religion, it's a way of life.
Mm-hmm.
And we are proud to say that, yes, we have a religion which has a way of life, which has ruling in every aspect. I mean, it teaches us how to rule, it teaches us how to live our daily life as well.
Okay, we come to you, Julian. I know we're discussing Islam, but I would actually like to look at it as maybe just faith and Western society, because I think even now it's more about Western and modernization, even disregarding faith as being Western as a whole. It can be seen to that some extent. So what's your opinion about that?
I think the issue in the West, as far as Islam is concerned, is that Western societies are not as religious as they are, and the presence of strong or conscious religion raises questions in societies which are often quite secular. So the cultural memory in the West of Christianity, particularly in Britain, has declined so much that people are not able to engage with Islam as a religion. But also what we see in the West and around the world is that people are getting their impressions of Islam from the media,
Yes.
and they associate it very much not with religion but with extremism and terrorism. My own experience as an interfaith activist and running the Christian Muslim Forum was, as a Christian, encountering Muslims and enabling other Christians and Muslims to meet each other, that there was sufficient commonality in faith outlook, so being turned towards God and living out the faith and religious practices, that there was scope for people to engage and meet and form friendships and cooperate together if ideology and doctrine and theology didn't get in the way.
Right.
And our texts encourage us to engage and to have dialogue with each other.
Right, yeah, that's very interesting as well, how you've highlighted it in that way. I was also thinking about the way in which our Muslims today actually live the way we should in our sort of, Western world. And the Islamic philosophy behind that too, and does it really coincide? Because even if people see what they see in the media, we are faced with Muslims every day, and people are aware that there is normality in the majority of Muslim mindsets, and there isn't really much extremism. Of course, if they want to have that philosophy or that way, they've got their own prejudice regardless. But the average person does see that. So how can we as Muslims take on that responsibility to represent what we really should be, so that we don't have that sort of disconnect? I can understand that religion does get into, a way of also being culture-based, and that is a problem, because it's traditions that's taken over even the actual religion, as far as I can see. And that's probably what most people see our religion as, more as being cultural and backwards. But if you get into the philosophy and the real theory of living as a Muslim, then a lot of it is actually quite Western ideas as well. So do you sort of support what I've just said, or is there sort of some sort of contradiction to that?
No, definitely. I totally agree with that. I think where we've got to find our, especially as Muslims, what we've got to do, especially now in the West, when we're second generation, third generation, we've got to kind of go back a few hundred years, where you had people who were apprentices. So, for example, you find Smith came from blacksmiths. So a father would become a blacksmith, then his son would become a blacksmith, then his grandson would become a blacksmith, etc., like that. So it's like an art that you learned. And I think what's happening now is that the youth is probably less educated or less kind of has less of that connection than, for example, the generation before that. So obviously there's a hadith that we don't inherit our religion, and it's, in many ways that's one of the issues that we're facing, is because because us as a younger generation, we kind of have both cultures combined to us.
Yeah.
We're kind of losing the real essence of one and the real essence of the other, and we're kind of combining it. So I think what we've got to do is we've got to go back a little bit deeper and start looking at the more kind of the deeper issues involved, and obviously have the scholars to guide us as well for that, because that, I think, is what's going to help us to start separating everything else, because I think it's all becoming a big cultural soup, effectively.
Right. So what could be, say, it's some of the examples that we could use for our modern day Muslims living in the West to say that our Islam, our way of living, is in coincide with Western values or Western ideology, taking away the fact that, you know, they look at religion, a set of beliefs, whether it's even Christianity or anything that shouldn't be part of, you know, this modern world. But if you take away that factor, if you just look at maybe the morals, the ethics, and some of the rulings that actually benefit everyone, even to the fact that, you know, the rights of women, for example, or things like that, which Islam has probably put, you know, these sort of rulings way before even Western society. So what other examples could we use to say that, you know, our religion or religion in itself as whole is not something that is actually backwards. It's not actually something that Westerners need to be afraid of, or to sort of, you know, put it to one side, because there are really good fundamental points there that we can live by and coincide and coexist, really.
Beauty of Islam or Islamic teachings is that it allows you to take the color of different colors. What I mean is that Islam does not oppose cultures as long as the culture does not contradict with Islamic teaching. So, for example, if Islam goes to India, it takes a bit of culture.
Right.
If it goes to Iran or Persia, it takes a bit of culture there. And in future, I mean, Western Muslims would be identified as Western Muslims. They would have, it's already known, our youth and children, they cannot be compared to the Muslims in the Muslim countries. They have their own unique culture. But the mistake is when the culture takes over the religion. That is what the scholars and Muslims should be aware of. And we should not allow culture to take over the religion. And otherwise, Islam is very open from this point of view. For example, in relation to hijab, an Arab woman may wear an abaya, or a Western, a Muslim woman in the West may wear something else, or a Muslim lady in India and Pakistan may wear a sari and a scarf. That would be considered as hijab as well.
Of course.
But in other cultures, it may not be.
Yes, of course. I understand what you're saying, and a lot of us do see ourselves in that way, and we are actually having Muslims obviously from around the world with their own cultures and things like that, but there seems to be a lot of judgmental even within our own Muslim people. And
the conflicts happen in the families because of that, because one party imposes the culture, not Islam, on other, like husband or wife.
That is being
so
like as if
that
it's the
causes
rule.
Problems.
Absolutely. I have had shows before in different channels addressing the issue of culture and religion as well, which I think I need to revisit. But yeah, Julian, coming to you again, how do you see from an outsider's point of view with regards to our religion, Islam? Do you see it as like quite cultural based? Do you see it as something that is not really modern? Because, you know, I want to get a real opinion here. It's not about, you know, wrong or right. It's just what you see is what you see. And maybe if it is something negative, then we need to obviously be aware and open so that we can change and we can actually evolve for the benefit, because to be honest, our religion is not that. So I want to sort of pinpoint what are the issues directly to the individual and how are we being seen so that we can actually make these adjustments.
So I don't see myself as an outsider to the Muslim community.
You know what I'm... Yeah, I mean like an outsider faith, yes, of course.
Because I've worked and prayed and been very close to Muslim colleagues and friends. And unconsciously did that from when I first started working in Christian-Muslim relations, that I wanted to find out as much as possible initially, reading the Quran, which was where I started. That was my first experience of Islam, reading the Quran. And then experiencing it as deeply as possible. So one of the pivotal experiences for me, which was quite unique, and there are not many Christians who've done this, was spending 2 days on itikaf.
Oh wow!
In
Okay.
a mosque in Nottingham with one of my colleagues, who was the imam there, to find out what he was doing, why he was on retreat in the masjid for the last 10 days of Ramadan, and what it might mean to be a Christian in that space, in the heart of the community, in the heart of the mosque, in the heart of Ramadan, with the final recitations taking place. And for me to develop that appreciation and understanding of what Islam was really about, which most people will not get anywhere near.
Yeah.
Now, since that was back in 2007, since then, various things have happened which have been led by the Muslim community, like the Big Iftar, people like Julie Siddiqui, and the Open Iftar project with the Ramadan tent around the university in the centre of London. And there have been a number of these initiatives where the Muslim community, and it's led by possibly Western Muslims or certainly younger Muslims.
The new generation, yeah.
That's right. And people like Dilwar Hussain and Rabia Hanan, who run New Horizons.
Right.
Who are thinking about Islam in a British context and what it means to live out and implement Islam in this society and build bridges with the rest of society, with people of all religions, even with people who have left Islam, so keeping those interactions going, with atheists and humanists, because good religion, and certainly this is true of both Islam and Christianity, are about dialogue.
Yes.
They're about listening to each other, and they're about winning over the enemy, if you like. Sometimes we're talking about actual enemies, and sometimes where there is sort of animosity and misgivings and hate and fear and prejudice. And many of those things come from not understanding. And those opportunities are not necessarily there. So being able to sit down and read scripture with Muslims, or to break the fast during Ramadan, is very transformative for people.
Yeah.
And we need as many opportunities as possible, and lots of mosques around the country have joined in that, and the Open My Mosque programme as well.
Yes, of course, that's been around the country. Yeah.
But still there is, amongst part of the population, you can see it in the British society, I can't remember, there's a survey which goes, British Survey of Attitudes, something like that, where they do a survey regularly and look at attitudes towards Islam and other subjects. Part of British society, tends to be about a third, have the very negative misgivings. Others have experienced Islam and Muslims, and they've come to see that their fears were not justified. And there's this sort of an undecided bit in the middle. The more interaction there is, the more people get an accurate impression by meeting actual Muslims. And you can see it on social media. People say, we went to York Mosque and we were welcomed with tea and biscuits, and we played football with people from the mosque, and it's a great experience. And then that opens so many doors.
Of course. You are one of the very few actually that has that insight and obviously taken the initiative to do that, even with the numbers that are increasing. But with the everyday average person that, you know, is bombarded by media and how we are perceived and how, you know, the minority extremists are sort of blown up like as if it sort of represents everyone, is something to play part. So even when Muslims are trying to put their word and voice out there, it's not necessarily heard by the right people and they're not being represented correctly as well. So there is that to also consider. And I think also that our Muslims need to step up a little bit more, and I think that we need to open ourselves up a little bit more. And I know that there's two sides of it, the way I see, because even in the West I feel like now, obviously with secularism and also trying to be this modern way of thinking, is not having faith. And having faith is something which is backward, regardless of the faith. It's not being seen in that way. So it's basically like, it's like a tip, you know, from one extreme to another, instead of trying to integrate it and trying to find the similarities in order so that we can coexist with our differences. But it seems to be that it wants to eradicate completely, as we see even in China, you know, the sort of ways of, you know, trying to have, whether it's a system or a way of thinking that is just from one institutional way. And this is not our life, this is not our world. Our world is a rainbow, it's full of colors, and faith, religion, whatever it may be, even non-faith, and we should all coexist. And our, you know, religion in particular does actually say that. But do you feel our Muslims really represent that?
I would say they do. I mean, whenever I go, we always see how open and generous Muslims are. And for example, I was just in Copenhagen last week, and I saw a documentary, and it showed, for example, they went through Syria, through Damascus, and they said there was a big problem there, because what's happening is the men, they want to go to work, they want to open their shops, but there's no one there. But because they have a shame of staying at home, they still want to go to work. So there's one man, and the journalist, he went round and he went to one shop, and the guy there, he basically made his first sale in 7 years. So the guy who was a journalist bought 2 of his carpets, which is his first sale for 7 years. And I think what we're finding that as Muslims, we're feeling very much on the other end. And I think, you know, one of the key things we've got to start understanding is we've got a choice. And the choice is, for example, if we look at the word patient, the word patient comes from the Latin word pati, which basically has 2 meanings. The first meaning means to suffer, or the second meaning means to surrender. And as Muslims, we've got a choice. We can either suffer and think this is a harsh world, we're being treated very badly, or we can surrender and we can accept that this is the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He's testing us, He's trying to make us better, and He's given us an opportunity now to actually show who we are and show even better. And I think what we need to do now, especially as Muslims, is we've got to understand what these true words are. And if we look at I think the word that all Muslims need to understand really deeply is the word hero. Because what the word hero means in its original sense is it doesn't mean someone who goes out and fights dragons or goes out and kills people. What it means is someone who protects. So, for example, if we look at Ashura, Imam Hussein was a hero. Why? Because he protected the real message of Islam. And in many ways, we've got to take these examples, and we've also got to protect our real meaning of Islam as well. And like Julian said, it's all about the way people interact. And how we've got to do it is we've got to take our responsibility that when someone reads about a negative message of Islam, they see us. So, for example, I just saw yesterday there was an example with an interview with Oprah Winfrey and Elizabeth Gilbert, the lady who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. Yes. And she said that when she was in Indonesia, there was this one poor woman, and she basically made sure she had food. And Elizabeth, she said that whenever she sees or hears about Islam, that for her is a representation. So we've got to make sure that when someone sees or hears about Islam, they see us, they see all of us Muslims, and see us as opposed to the image that's being portrayed. And I think that's how we can do it, by being responsible and being heroic about it.
Of course, thank you. Sorry, we do have a caller online. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam, sister, and salam to my brother Julian as well. Nice to see that there's somebody there as well. MashaAllah. Now, since I've been listening to all this discussion and everything, I mean, I think there is a tug of war going on between the West and third world country, probably. Now, if you talk about culturally wise, I mean, if you take the people in British as a Britain and the Europeans have got different culture. They probably go to the churches and they've got their ways of worshipping the same God. You see? And this applies to Muslims as well. We come from different parts. As Molana said, to bring culture into your practices, into the religion, there is no harm. Islam says you can do it because that's why we are created differently, so we can learn from each other. Now, I don't know why we discuss, every time I say we are discussing about Islam and Islam is supposed to change. Why should we change? There are good things about us. It should be promoted. It's give and take as well, isn't it?
Of course.
And I think when we talk about the Western civilization, I don't know, is it a civilization? Because we have destroyed everything. What is there left for us? You know, we have not even bothered about upcoming generation who is going to come, which are our children.
Yeah.
You know, and I think the West is probably saying, and they brought more destruction into the world as a whole. They polluted everything, but then they will just turn around and probably blame the other side. And I don't think whether this is right, to be honest about it, because I think we have got some good things, and Christianity or the Judaism and Islam, all three religion teach good things about keeping the world, because this is the only world we have got, and then we are looking for something else where we can't even look after our own world, which God has given it to us. And then we want to go somewhere else and destroy that as well. So, I mean, I think we Muslims have to wake up and voice ourselves. I think what we are doing, we have always been discussed, you know, what is bad about Islam. But why don't you talk about what is good about Islam? I think this is one thing that we have to really fight for, because we are quite a large community in this country, or in Europe as well. And secondly, if Islam was so bad, why Islam is the fastest growing religion? Because the people who are looking into Islam, they are not looking at Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which is not our creation. Somebody else has created. The enemy is just behind destroying us. And I think we are the only force which we are resisting. And I think we should really alert ourselves and try to promote ourselves in their cultural way. I think this is the only solution. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your call. I really appreciate it. And some really interesting points, actually. In fact, it actually highlighted, maybe I wasn't clear enough in the past of this discussion, that actually I'm actually not trying to say that Islam needs to change. My whole point is that Islam in its essence does exist the way it should be, and maybe our Muslims are using more of the culture to bring it down. And culture is a good thing to use forward, but like, you know, the Syed said, it should be to enhance what we believe in, instead of like pushing us backwards with tradition, for example, unless of course it's, you know, for the benefit. So I totally agree. And to be honest, it brings to my next question is, what does the West actually represent? What is the meaning of Western even ideology and society, especially because our faith comes from divine, and it stays and sticks in its way for everyone, and it doesn't need changing or reforming. It's just that people's interpretation obviously does differ. But if everyone was to come together, even of any other faith, to actually read it and go through it and research it, it does make a lot of sense to everyone and to ordinary people. So what do you say about that?
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank the caller, and he raised a very good point. And the question is not so much of is Islam good or bad, but I think we should rephrase that question of how has Islam benefited the West?
Yeah.
And if we go back to the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, what we actually find is it was actually Islam that took that took Europe out of the Dark Ages. And how that happened essentially was that Plato in the Republic, he stated that the head should be a philosopher king, like we have our scholars. And what happened, obviously, then we had the feudal lords, and they were basically ruling by power. And that whole ideology came back of Plato, which is where we started having more scholars at the head, and effectively that started taking Europe out of the Dark Ages. And I think likewise we've come back very much full circle. And before that was a different Dark Ages. I think now we're in a very spiritual Dark Ages. And I find, especially if you look, I mean, a prime example is if you just go on a train right now. One of my friends was telling me this earlier. He was saying that if you go on a train and you just look at how many people are smiling, you see not a single person is smiling. I mean, I've done this about 25, 30 times. I've looked through the whole carriage. I've not seen a single person smiling. So I'm thinking what's happening now is we're finding ourselves in a very spiritual kind of, effectively spiritual Dark Ages. We're seeing so much turbulation in terms of Brexit, in terms of politics, in terms of divisions, etc. like that. And what's happening now is I think spirituality is starting to come to the forefront, and all of the religions, people are starting to go towards them to find answers, because they're not finding the answers externally. They're not finding it through the money, through this, through that, through that.
Definitely.
So people are going to look inside. And I think that as a result of that, like the caller said, I think this is where Islam plays its big role, because I think Islam, along with Judaism, Christianity, and all of the other religions where people will find their own answers, will help people to find deeper meaning and help us to come out of these spiritual Dark Ages that I feel that we're in at the moment.
No, that's very true. I mean, we always look at things on an external factor, even when it comes to policies and social issues and things like that. But when you look at the individual, even if we're saying that, yes, the Western society and world is, more materialistic and more individualistic and more, institutionalizing, certain individuals. But as we can see, the result of that, even if they're trying to push that forward, the individual is not actually benefiting and it's not serving them. Whereas where even most self-development specialists and gurus that I'm quite, in tune with my profession, they do say that the higher being is obviously looking beyond themselves and to someone higher, especially in the spiritual terms, and something more divine, whether you want to call it the universe, God, creation, whatever it may be, angels. And it does bring something more, and people are sort of clocking on to say that, yes, what is this Western ideology mean really, especially if it sort of says that, to disregard faith or religion or any kind of religion in a particular way of being, and it doesn't really help society and it's backwards and whatever it may be. But say there are examples that there is in conflict, especially recently, especially with we've had issues with RSC and things like that where there's conflict, and even today watching in the news, at the end of the day, how do we move forward with our traditional ideologies and the Westerners trying to say that, well, we are not being fair and we're not actually seeing the other side and the other foot and another perspective because it's only from our religious-based faith?
I think Western civilization is a problem for not only Islam, for all divine faiths.
Of course.
All divine faiths.
Absolutely.
And this conclusion was achieved in one of the conferences where Christian, Muslims and Jews and followers of all divine faiths had gathered together in London a few years ago. And an Ayatollah from Iran, Ayatollah Taskhiri, he's still alive, he had come to take part in this conference, and he gave a lengthy speech about the problems of the Western civilization and how it damages Islam and Muslim societies. So the church leaders came to him and said, you are complaining about Western civilization in the Muslim world. We are complaining about Western civilization in the West because it is damaging our churches. So this is where we need to be united. We need to work together. We need to identify why Western civilization is targeting the family values, why it is damaging the society, and the divine faiths have to work together to sort out this problem.
Julian, what is it in your experience that you see that has happened now, where even like you said, it's been diminished in, Christianity being in this Western world where, it's taking a second sort of like stand, and what is being done, not necessarily even amongst just the Christians, but is there any sort of dialogue that's happening to revive maybe the church again, or people of faith, or is it just something that's now, doesn't have much of a say and a right, and it's just completely diminished?
Well, the churches are working on sharing their message and talking to society and going out into the community and inviting people into churches. But I think what we don't see enough of across the board, both religious and non-religious, is enough dialogue. So people actually listening to each other. I think that's really important, to talk to the people, sit with the people that we all disagree with, and for the people who disagree with us to sit and talk with us. So we see it not happening in the political world, and we see the Prime Minister not listening to criticism of what he said about women wearing burqas.
Yeah.
And government seems not good at all with conversation. So this has been one of the things coming from the Muslim community and through the interfaith movement, to try to encourage those conversations and say, well, you're not listening and you're not talking to these people, and this is what you need to do in order to build bridges and to include everybody. And some of that represents parts of Western civilization and ideology, which has been to have a sort of colonial mindset, an imperialist, and to interfere, and the sort of white saviour ideology. People think that Muslim women need to be saved from their clothing.
Yeah.
And these are all examples of ideology which doesn't communicate. And ideally, people of faith would model the conversation, just as we saw the Prophet Mohamed and Jesus Christ doing.
Yeah.
They talked to everybody. They opened the conversation. They welcomed people in. Even the people who were difficult and antagonistic and doing things which were offensive around them, they were still welcomed and included, and they were patient and they forgave them. And we don't necessarily follow the prophetic models.
Yes, definitely not.
And even as people of faith, we get tribal and we get sectarian, and we're not open to talking to each other. And if we modelled it, maybe we could encourage it more in society. There was a book which came out recently by an academic called John Holroyd.
Right.
The title of the book is Judging Religion. And he's not religious himself, although he's from a religious background, and he evaluates Christianity and Islam and religion generally from a moral perspective, asking, is religion moral? And he concludes with the importance of dialogue and says that we should all be involved in dialogue, that we should not be saying this person is the enemy, I'm not going to talk to them.
Yeah.
And in order to build a civilised society together, people of faith and people of no faith need to be working together, and we need to be opening up conversations with atheist, secular and humanist groups.
Yes, definitely.
Particularly where they're campaigning against religion. And we need to try to open up those conversations. And when we're talking about Western civilization, we're also talking about secularism, materialism and capitalism as well.
Yeah, no, I do see that as a problem. I think when there's complete disagreement and complete opposition, we tend to be us and them. And like you said, that open dialogue and those difficult discussions are definitely needed, but on an open platform, because the power has been taken away from scholars and religious leaders and things like that. And, you know, and government and anyone else is not going to listen when we don't have the individual there. And to bring the individual, we need to have, you know, our own communities and societies bringing groups together, and then from there interlinking and alliancing with, you know, different faiths and, you know, backgrounds, wherever it may be, and then go up, you know, the ladder and work in that way, and sort of, you know, it can filter. So I totally agree with that, and it's so true, because we always pointing the finger like we do in politics and just bringing the other one down and just, you know, raising the faults and things like that, but having these discussions like we do today, and I wasn't even expecting to have you, and it was a divine sort of blessing as well that you were here to join us today to actually add to this conversation, because it's really important, and I think it's fitting with what we're trying to do, because even though the title is Islam, you know, comparable with basically the Western society, it's literally anyone that is not Western background or not any sort of faith. That's what I think it comes down to. And I think the individual needs to look at Western as being, okay, we have this thing of having us everyone look as a whole, but we all are not coming from one set like machine. We're not produced in that way. And so we need to sort of have that diversity, but, you know, sort of collaborate with that diversity. So we are coming towards the end of the show. I cannot believe it's gone so quickly. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to hear some final words maybe from yourself, each one, just before we conclude.
Well, I think the first thing, like Julian was saying, is we've got to start getting things into perspective. Mm-hmm. Because the reason why we don't collect as communities is because we make our problems much bigger than other people's problems.
Of course,
so we've got to start having more compassion, more empathy, and start realizing other people are fighting just as much battles as we are. And if we can all combine together, we can actually use each other's wisdoms to actually get better solutions.
Perfect, thank you. Syed.
I believe that dialogue should be with mutual understanding. And I mean, recently I was in one of the universities in Colombia. One of the gay and lesbians criticized Islam. Mm-hmm. And she said Islam by gay and lesbians are not accepted. I listened to the criticism. And when I wanted to give my opinion, they were not ready to listen.
Right.
So, I mean, if you expect us to listen to your view, you should also accept us as a person who disagrees with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it has to be mutual understanding both ways.
Julian, finally.
I think we all have a great opportunity in the West. So thinking about the Muslim communities in Britain, many younger Muslims have been educated in Christian schools, although they've also been educated in Christian schools in India and Pakistan and various other places. So there is more knowledge of Christianity, for example, amongst British Muslims than there is knowledge of Islam amongst British Christians. And I've had experience of sitting next to Muslim friends in church and people joining in as they felt they could, in hymns, in rituals, and even in prayers, because they are so familiar. So I led a dialogue event in St Ethelburg, in the City of London, and there was a Muslim woman sitting behind me as I led the prayers, and she was praying the Lord's Prayer because it was just normal for her, because she prayed it in school. And letting everyone know that and how mixed we are and what a good thing that is, and there's not enough awareness of it.
Absolutely, and I think also we have to be aware that even if we have our faith, we can actually still appreciate another person's faith, because I think especially what you highlighted, that's probably quite, you know, rare that maybe a Muslim woman might do that, because I know of people that are actually, you know, saying, oh, well, I don't want my kids to be part of the Christmas play, for example. So we need to really open up our minds and know where do we stand in this, and maybe another show to actually highlight our rules about this. And that's why also we're seen as being backward and not integrating and not being part of certain things. And, you know, there is some sort of dialogue that needs to be further, you know, said to that, and to what extent are we able to go to have these sort of like interactions and sort of do that. But Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much to my guests for participating and for the viewers, the callers. We really do appreciate that. The show is yours, and the more you take part, the more we can actually address your issues. And hopefully with these prominent and professional guests, we can actually give you some of the answers that you seek. And inshallah, we will be back with another topic and new guests next week. And until then, we'll see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.